Uh, uh, Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction. Um, so, before I start the talk, I want to start with a question. So, if the sent box of your emails was hacked and published as you listen to this presentation, what image of you would that give to the world? And if you selected and organized your own emails for publication, what would that publication look like? How would those two things be different? And which of those sort of just the contents of your inbox or your selection would be the real you? These are some questions we can consider when we think of ancient authors as well. Um, Here we have a quote by Demetrius on styles. This is part of a long work on different sorts of style. Demetrius is going to, when he talks about the simple style, we'll talk about letters as an example of that. And he includes this interesting remark. Like the dialogue, the letter should be strong in characterization. Everyone writes a letter in the virtual image of his own soul. In every other form of speech, it is possible to see the writer's character, but in none so clearly as in the letter. So when we think of autobiography by letter, this is where, in theory, we're going to see the soul of the person. So the three authors that I'm going to talk about today are, and I'm looking at Latin examples. This is Latin epistolography, Latin letter writing. We have Pliny, early imperial period Roman author, senator. All three of them are senators. Pliny, Symmachus, writing several centuries later, so in the late Empire, and Sidonius Apollinaris, writing in the very late Empire, and in fact bridging the empire and what follows. He lives through the collapse of Roman government in the Western Empire. So these are our three authors. And the reason why I'm discussing them together is because Sidonius actually mentions Pliny and Symmachus as his models, as we'll see. So some other authors of extant Latin letter collections, so we have Cicero in the late Republic, Ovid in the period of Augustus, Seneca in the early Roman Empire, Pliny we mentioned, Fronto, tutor to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, so in the 2nd century, Cyprian, bishop in North Africa, Augustine and Ambrose. So Cyprian, Augustine, and Ambrose are all bishops. I'm not going to talk about them as much. It's a bit of a different genre, but they do also write in Latin. Now, of course, these are some extant letter publications. Most letters that were written in antiquity were, of course, never published and don't survive. And it's also, when we're thinking of letters as autobiography, it's worth pointing out that the fact that a letter collection is published doesn't necessarily make it an autobiography. So the letters by Ovid, the Heroides, are not, they're purely fictional. So in those letters, which are actually written in verse, so Ovid is a poet. He has letters by Penelope to Odysseus, Medea to Jason, so letters by mythological women. Clearly, these are not autobiography, so that's its own thing. Some of the collections, like Cicero's, at least most of Cicero's and Fronto's, would be not assembled by the author themselves. Probably also true of Cyprian. And so that wouldn't be autobiography because the collection itself is not the work of the author, it's the work of a later editor. And if we think of Seneca's letters are real, presumably real letters. They seem to be assembled by Seneca himself. But they're a bit different in that they're not concerned so much with the life of the author, Seneca, as with the life of the reader. So Seneca is trying to teach Lucilius, his addressee, how to live a better life. In the process, Seneca actually says a fair bit about himself, and he gives anecdotes. He gets quite personal. But this isn't, he's not trying to write autobiography. It's a different thing. These are letters of mentorship. The three collections that we're going to talk about, and this would also probably be true of letters to Ambrose as well. These are, we can meaningfully think of the letters of Pliny, of the letters of Symmachus, and letters of Sidonius as autobiography. And that's, I'll consider them in that light. When we talk about autobiography, though, it's worth just bearing in mind that it's not quite autobiography as we would think of it now, where it starts at birth and covers childhood and then goes till whenever the author publishes it. These letter collections really only cover the later life of their author. So Symmachus lived 340 to 402 about. His letters really only cover the later part of that, and especially cover the last decade of his life. So it's heavily focused on later life. And with Sidonius, that's also true, and with Pliny. If the author does mention earlier life, it's as a recollection later. So Pliny famously writes a letter on the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. So he's writing long after the eruption of this volcano, but he's describing what he remembers from the time. And he's actually writing it to the historian Tacitus, trying to get it into Tacitus's histories. So it's a little bit different in that sense from what we think of as autobiography. It's a very focused autobiography. Another thing to bear in mind is that the kind of picture that the letter collection gives may or may not have the same emphases as the author's official cursus. So that is the official state career as presented in a funeral inscription, so all the titles of the author. We actually do get a fair amount of that in Sidonius and Pliny. Symmachus, we get something slightly different, so it's not necessarily one form of summary of the person's life is not necessarily the same as another. All right, so let's start with Pliny then. So Pliny the Younger was a Roman senator. He starts out as his family was actually equestrian, so it's the one rank below senator. But he makes it to the Senate, and he lives around 61 to around 113 CE. What we have with Letters of Pliny is a collection in 10 books, so 9 books of regular letters, which are all letters to regular people, but they're all somewhat literary in tone. And then a 10th book of letters to the Emperor Trajan, which was likely sort of its own thing, might have been added later. So the 9 books and then a 10th book, we'll keep that in mind because we'll see that again. Oh yeah, and again, when we're talking about books of letters, a book is as much as would fit on a scroll. So 9 books of letters is a fairly voluminous correspondence. The letters of Pliny as we have them are introduced by a dedicatory epistle, so an intro letter. Septicius, one of Pliny's friends. To Septicius, you've frequently pressed me to make a select collection of my letters, if there be any which show some literary finish, and give them to the public. So this was your idea, not mine. I have accordingly done so, not indeed in their proper order of time, for I was not compiling a history, but just as they presented themselves to my hands. So Pliny's going to suggest that there's a certain randomness to this. He's probably overstating his case there. Clearly there is some kind of order to the letters, but there's an impression of artlessness. And now what remains but to wish that neither you may have occasion to repent of your advice, nor I of my compliance. So let's hope this works. If so, I may probably inquire after the rest, which at present lie neglected, the rest of the letters, and not withhold those I shall hereafter write. So Pliny was not the first person to think of publishing his letters. In fact, he doesn't credit himself with the idea here. Cicero had clearly started thinking of it in his letters. What's interesting here is that we get, so this introduces a first installment of the letters. There's more get published afterwards. So Pliny's letters were originally published the books were installments. And he's highlighting the fact both that they are literary letters, so they're clearly suitable for publication, intended for a discerning literary audience. And some of the later letters would have been written with the thought that they might be published. So that would probably affect the kinds of letters that Pliny writes. Here we have the image to the right is Lake Como, where Pliny has a villa and where he has his hometown ties. So what kind of image does Pliny give in his letters? So he's presenting a certain side of himself. So what is he presenting? He seems to be presenting himself as at the center of Rome's literary scene. So Pliny is, we have letters where he writes to Tacitus, the historian. The letter on the eruption of Mount Vesuvius is actually to Tacitus. Pliny writes to Sidonius, the biographer. So again, two major figures whose works we still have. He exchanges poetry with his friends. He's really trying to position himself at the center of Rome's literary scene. And this has been noted by Ronald Syme in his book on Tacitus. Pliny is also positioning himself as humane. So in one of the letters, we see him endowing a children's charity, the Alimenta program, where children can get free food. And generally he comes across as just a nice person in the letters. And he's also, to use kind of a fraught modern term, politically correct. He's on the right side of history here. Pliny shows that he's critical of the former Emperor Domitian, and yes, this was published after Domitian was safely dead. In fact, the relevant letters were certainly most of them written before Domitian, after Domitian died. So we see in these letters there's eulogies of opponents of Domitian. Pliny is associating himself with them, and he's also attacking one particular collaborator of Domitian, someone called Romanus. So this is part of the kind of image that Pliny is presenting in his letters. Oh yeah, and that's Lake Como again. This is a reconstruction of one of Pliny's villas. Pliny describes his villas in a number of letters. This one's described in letter, so ep is epistula, so letter 5.6. Yeah, the letters tend to be quite descriptive, so they're literary in Turning to Sidonius Apollinaris, so we're going much later, and I'll come back to Symmachus later, but talk about the last person. He's living in the 5th century, so the century when Roman administration is collapsing in Gaul, which is where Sidonius is from. Sidonius, like Pliny, is writing a letter collection in 9 books, so we don't have that 10th book to emperors. By the end of Sidonius's life, there wouldn't be a whole lot of emperors for him to write to. Yeah, we have clearly in number of books, it parallels Pliny. And as we'll see, that's actually a parallel which he specifically draws himself. So if we compare the dedicatory epistle in Pliny to that in Sidonius, Sidonius is covering the same ground. So where Pliny says, "You have frequently pressed me to make a select collection of my letters, if there be any that would show some literary finish, and give them to the public." Sidonius is going to say, "My honored lord, you have this long while been pressing me, and you have every claim to my attention, for you are a most competent advisor on the matters about to be discussed, to collect all the letters making any little claim to taste which have flowed from my pen on different occasions, as this or that affair, person, or situation called them forth, and to revise and correct the originals and combine all in a single book." Sidonius is much more verbose than Pliny, but he's covering the same ground. So it's the same ideas, he's just amplifying it. If you look at this in Latin, Sidonius actually never exactly echoes the wording in Pliny, so he's varying it, but he covers the same ground. And in fact, he actually cites Pliny as a model. So in doing so, I should be following, though with presumptuous steps, the path traced by Quintus Symmachus with his rounded style, and by Gaius Plinius with his highly developed artistry. And generally, scholars, the parallels to Pliny are fairly obvious. Parallels to Symmachus are not obvious at all. In fact, all this, in the case of Symmachus, all this really seems to mean is that Symmachus had published letters and that Sidonius was aware of it. But with Pliny, Sidonius does follow in the tradition of Pliny fairly closely. The image here, to the right here is the region of Avitacum, which is Sidonius's villa, which he describes in similar terms to the villas of Pliny in one of his letters. The kind of image that you get in Sidonius's letters is that he's cultured, and part of being cultured is that he knows Pliny. He writes in a particular kind of Latin, and also that he's important and has a kind of continued relevance for the region. And here we have to say a bit about Sidonius's career. So Sidonius starts out as a Roman senator. Well, he's involved in the Senate. He gives although he's based out of Gaul, he does an embassy to Rome. He's urban prefect of Rome briefly. He's actually son-in-law to one of the emperors, Avitus, fairly short-lived emperor. And then later, when the possibilities for a secular career are ending, Sidonius makes the switch to a career as a bishop, and he becomes the bishop of Clermont-Ferrand in central France. And in the letters, he really emphasizes that despite changes in circumstances, that he maintains his importance. And some of the letters, especially the earlier letters, really emphasize his wealth. So he's showing off his property. Turning to Symmachus, who was cited by Sidonius, so we're going a bit earlier now. And again, we get a 10-book collection, so 9 books to regular people, a 10th book to emperors, although the 10th book only has 3 letters actually surviving in it. So the obvious model here seems to be Pliny, so Pliny did that. One thing to note, though, is that the original collection seems to have been 7 books. Not 10 books. So books 8, 9, and 10 were apparently added by a later editor afterwards from Symmachus's unpublished files. So they are real letters. They're new letters, but they were added later. The original collection doesn't seem to have been based on Pliny's. And in fact, it's been pointed out that Symmachus doesn't actually show much familiarity with Pliny. There's only one letter of Pliny that he actually verbally echoes, that he obviously read. The collection of Symmachus doesn't have a dedicatory epistle, so there's no first letter saying, like, I'm publishing my letters. That could mean that Symmachus did not, in fact, publish them himself. We know, at least if we go to letters, like books 2 onward, that it was published by his son. So it could just be he never got around to writing the dedicatory epistle, and after he's dead, of course, it's too late to come up with one. But it could also just be that he didn't have Pliny's dedicatory epistle in mind, so that wasn't he didn't see that as a necessary part of the publication. And of course now it's hard to tell. The image to the right there, that's actually an ancient ivory diptych of not necessarily of Symmachus himself, but it's something connected with his family, so this could be Symmachus. Here at the right, you see another. This again is a diptych connected with Symmachus's family. At the top right, you see Symmachorum, so of the Symmachi of the family of Symmachus. And at the top left, and a bit harder to see, Nicomachorum, so of the Nicomachi, the family of Nicomachus. The Symmachi and the Nicomachi were closely associated in Symmachus's time, and were actually intermarried over several generations. And the collection that we get focuses a lot on family and friends. So we have, of the original 7 books, 2 whole books. So the second book and the second last book are both written entirely to members of the Nicomachi. So 2 would be to a father, and 6 to the second last to his son. So a major focus on family and friends. And what kind of image are we getting in the letters? It's so some comments that have been made about the letters is that they're dull. The French editor of the Bude edition of Symmachus said in his introduction to the first book, there are few people who read Symmachus, and those who have often asked whether it was worth the trouble. And of course, most of these authors have had unkind opinions of them at some point. But Symmachus' letters are relatively devoid of content. They're not as descriptive, they're not as literary as the letters of Pliny or Sidonius. And they don't tell us that much about Symmachus' career. So career successes like Symmachus' consulship, which is at the height of the cursus honorum, the highest, it's just an honor, but the highest honor you could get at this point. The consulship, so symbolic, the consul at this point was symbolic head of state. Symmachus mentions that in passing, but he de-emphasizes it in the letter collection. And what he seems to be saying about himself here is that he was a friend and not a careerist flatterer. So a friend rather than a flatterer. And just the image you see to the right here is Bauli near, it's on the Bay of Naples, it's near modern Naples, and Symmachus, one of the first letters of his collection is about this villa, the villa that he had there. Right, so the image in the letters is Symmachus' friend, not his flatterer, and I'll just briefly talk about the notion of friendship and flattery in antiquity. It's been most fully explored by Plutarch. So Plutarch, who wrote about the same time as Pliny, but in Greek, most famous for his parallel lives of Greek and Roman men. Pliny writes how to tell the friend from the flatterer, and he develops with an interest in character the notions of flattery and frankness. And flattery in Greek, kolakia, so saying to someone, you look radiant, when what you're really thinking is you smell bad, and frankness, saying what you think. So parousia in Greek. For Plutarch, the flatterer is a particular kind of false friend. And unlike the parasite and the treacherous friend, whose true nature becomes evident relatively quickly, the flatterer may actually go undetected throughout their entire life. The flatterer is going to imitate an altruistic friend, and is going to imitate that quite well. In Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, he divides three kinds of friends. So there's the useful friend, the pleasant friend, and the altruistic friend. The flatterer is not an altruistic friend, but the flatterer pretends to be an altruistic friend and passes for one. And but with bad effects for the character of the person being flattered. As Plutarch says, you can always tell someone's a flatterer by the fact that they're cheerful. So the flatterer is always going to be cheerful, but although he later goes on to say that just because someone's cheerful doesn't necessarily mean they're a flatterer, because friends are naturally pleasant. But if someone is a flatterer, they will be pleasant. And Plutarch says a better way to tell the friend from the flatterer is to pretend to change your own tastes, and then see, does the flatterer change with you? The flatterer will always change with you because they adapt themselves to suit you, and as he says, they're not simple, not one, but variable and many in one. So that's Plutarch's flatterer. In terms of late Roman theory, so the notions of friendship, flattery, and frankness are still apply. But the focus in Symmachus, and it seems like in most of the texts in this period, is not on the moral effects of flattery on the flattered friend, which is what Plutarch's looking at. Plutarch, in his parallel lives, is always looking at the idea of character, so that's Plutarch's focus. For Symmachus, it's a bit more practical. It's just what does flattery do for your career? So flatterers, if you flatter the right people, you tend to do well in your career. But it's seen as a morally based way to do that. And Symmachus will distinguish between cultus, a word that in Latin can mean almost anything. He uses it for taking care of relationships. So altruistic cultus, so friends cultivate each other. On the one hand, and then self-interested ambitus. So in ambitus the word goes back to the Roman Republic. It meant electoral bribery there. Symmachus uses it for any kind of use of connections to get ahead. So these two things are contrasted in a number of his letters. And as a result, it's perhaps not surprising that Symmachus will, the fact that Symmachus doesn't mention his own career very much, in a context where he's talking about his friends, can be explained because he doesn't want to talk about his own career in the context of his friendships. That would put him too close to ambitus, so using connections to get ahead, which presumably he did, but he's not emphasizing that here. So to the right we have Symmachus's cursus. So this is the list of what he did on his tombstone: senatorial man, quaestor, praetor, greater pontifex, corrector, governor of Lucania and the Briti, which is in southern Italy, companion of the third order, so member of the imperial court, proconsul of Africa, urban prefect, ordinary consul, an exceedingly eloquent orator. And ordinary consul is clearly the summit of this. Pliny talks a lot about his consulship. Symmachus really doesn't talk about his, but he writes a lot about his son's praetorship. So he emphasizes career successes for his correspondents, for members of his family, but not for himself, because he's trying to distance himself, I think, from the notion that he was using his contacts to get the honors that he got. In the letters, Symmachus's most politically important friendship is with Stilicho. So if you really can't write the history of the end of the 4th century without talking about Stilicho. Stilicho was, after the death of the Emperor Theodosius, Stilicho was left as regent for for Theodosius's young son Honorius in the west. Stilicho manages to keep control of the government until he's eventually killed. For the late 300s, for the late 390s and early most of the first decade of the 400s, Stilicho is really supreme in the Western Empire. So he commands the army. He controls the imperial court. And this covers the period that's most fully covered by the letters, which is the later 390s. And Stilicho is probably still around and still in control of the government at the point when it's assumed that the letters were published, which is thought to be sometime between 402 and 408. So the letters of Stilicho in our collection, they're included, it's 4.1 to 4.14. In Symmachus, letters are always arranged by correspondence, so all the letters to Stilicho are together, all the letters to Symmachus' father are together, all the letters to Symmachus' son are together, so that's how they're arranged. Putting these at the beginning of Book 4 gives them the central place in the collection, so it seems to have been designed as a 7-book collection, where Book 7 and Book 1 mirror each other, Book 2 and Book 6 mirror each other, and Book 4 is at the center. That's where we find the letters to Stilicho. And the image to your right there is an ivory diptych showing Stilicho, and part of that which I cropped out was Stilicho's wife, who's the daughter of the emperor. So in the letters themselves, letters of Symmachus, the letters to Stilicho are always frank in tone. So Symmachus seems to want to show that he's not flattering Stilicho. Always frank, occasionally critical. So the first letter is, I'm writing to you, why don't you write back? What's wrong with you? So they're frank in tone. And the placement in the collection is interesting because the letters of Symmachus to Stilicho immediately follow letters from Symmachus to Stilicho's rival Rufinus, which is at the end of Book 3. And in fact, Stilicho and Rufinus were rivals to the point that Stilicho had Rufinus assassinated. Clearly, these could have been edited out. The fact that they're not edited out suggests that they're ostentatiously included, that the reader is supposed to notice them. And in fact, one reason why we might suppose that is that the letters to Rufinus come immediately after a series of letters to a series of generals, each of whom Rufinus himself eliminated. And all of these letters are similar in tone, relatively similar in number too. So there's a few more letters to Stilicho than to Rufinus, but it's not it's not grossly disproportionate. So what's going on here? A parallel that came to my mind that might shed some light on it is Shakespeare's King Lear, where we have Regan and Goneril and Cordelia, 3 daughters of the king. The king is about to give up his power, and he's giving out gifts, and he asks his daughter to say something nice about him, and Regan and Goneril say very nice things about their father. Cornelia expresses her love for him, but does it in much simpler terms. That turns out not to be enough, so she gets disinherited. And as it turns out, Regan and Goneril didn't actually love their father. Cornelia did. And I think in the letters, Symmachus is trying to present himself a bit like Cordelia, as someone who is recognizable as the true friend of Stilicho because he's not flattering him. Okay, so why this image? And in a letter collection, the author is always portrayed in a particular way, which is always intentional. Certainly, if the author designed the collection themselves. This is probably, we can usually assume that what we're seeing in the letters of Symmachus or the letters of Pliny or the letters of Sidonius is responding to an opposite opinion, which is currently held by their contemporaries. So if Symmachus emphasized in his letters that he didn't flatter Stilicho, then that probably suggests that some people thought that he did. And if you look at the kind of Symmachus's biography to the extent that we can reconstruct it, that actually makes sense. If Pliny is emphasizing that he was not a collaborator with Domitian, then it's likely that his contemporaries thought maybe he was. In fact, he did pretty well under Domitian. If Sidonius is arguing that he's still relevant, this is probably in response to ideas that he wasn't. So that gives kind of a hypothesis that we can test as we look at the letters, and that's part of interpreting letter collection, is to try to figure out what might this be responding to. All right, so that's what I had to say. Yeah, thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Chris. Do you want to unshare your screen maybe, and then we'll pause for a moment to allow people to think about that wide-ranging presentation, especially thinking of the temporal breadth, right from Pliny through to these authors from the later empire, and then also a rich array of topics. Maybe while people are thinking, and I'll remind everyone who's here, if you have a question for Dr. Lougheed, you can go to the Q&A button. I think is kind of in the middle at the bottom of your screen, if it's like mine, and you can add your question there, or you can simply put it in the chat as well, and I'll see it there and read it aloud. I was struck, Chris, by your introduction, which I quite liked, not only because I had advertised this talk on Twitter and mentioned, what if your Instagram feed was your self-representation? So I chose a different social media, but we live in this age of a heightened age of self-representation on all these social media channels. But I did take your point there with the sort of hacked email as the other thing that is also out there kind of in the cultural zeitgeist, where people's emails have been hacked, and what kind of image do you get versus these curated collections. And I know I've read before with modern authors, there's a question about whether we will have letter collections in the future, and now that people's correspondence ranges into the millions of emails, and how would maybe every letter collection would have to then be curated in a way that maybe early 20th century physical letter writing authors didn't have to. Yeah. With that, I might ask a question then. So I was struck by, I think it was Sidonius, you mentioned he mentioned, that he had revised and corrected his letters in his dedicatory epistle. And I wondered if you have anything to say about that in terms of, is there a way to sort of think about or investigate how these letters might differ from the so-called original? And is there a way to sort of get at what revision and what correction have been done to create the self-representation or the autobiography of the author that this collection represents?
Thanks for that. Yeah. So it is possible that revising and correcting means that he actually changed the wording of the original letter, and that has been suggested with letters of Symmachus. There was a stylometric analysis of the first book, and which seems to differ from later books in that it uses more archaic vocabulary. So that could have actually been added in later. Yeah, so there is some comparison that could be made there. With Pliny and Sidonius, it's a bit hard to gauge. But clearly, if you've already started installments for your letter collection, then you're writing new letters, which might be included. You might start from the get-go with a heightened style. So it's hard to know what was in the original and what was added in later. That's and unfortunately a bit hard to know.
No, fair enough. I'm asking for things from evidence doesn't exist, so yeah, that's true. Maybe on the same note, I would ask a question about Symmachus. So you mentioned that the original was likely the 7 book collection, and then this, epistles 1 to 14 were thus the centerpiece. But I was intrigued by the idea that 8, 9, and 10, the 8th, 9th, and 10th books were added afterwards, perhaps by someone else, and you said with access to Symmachus's files. And so I just wondered if, have people then or yourself investigated, what are the types of letters that appear in 8, 9, and 10 significantly different than those in the first 7 books? Do you think that the addition of these 3 books then upsets this carefully balanced collection that focuses in on Epistle 4? How does it alter the whole collection?
The later ones, yeah, in some cases we have letters that, in some cases we don't even have, the addressee is lost. So these are, in 1 to 7, they're always organized by addressee. Later on, that gets a bit looser. There are also some letters in Book 9 that just make Symmachus look bad. So it's things that he probably wouldn't have wanted to add in himself. We have 2 letters where he's trying to get a Vestal Virgin executed for adultery, and no one's cooperating with him, and he followed up with someone and then follows up with someone else again afterwards. And this is probably something that he wouldn't have, well, I don't know, it depends who he's writing for, but probably not something he would have published. We actually do get a Michel Salzman, who's worked a bit on the letters of Symmachus, has suggested that one of the letters in Book 9 is written to Ausonius, who is an addressee in Book 1. But in Book 1, you always, Symmachus is writing to Ausonius as an established friend, and the letter, which is probably to Ausonius, is where Symmachus is trying to get Ausonius to be his friend. So Symmachus, he seems to want to present himself as negotiating, as corresponding with people from a position of kind of established friendship and independence. And in terms of like just the literary, does it upset the balance? Yeah, I think. When you add the books, it increases, it creates this link with Pliny, but it's no longer the work that Symmachus himself apparently planned. Yeah.
People have questions. As I said, put them in the Q&A or the chat. I have lots of questions for Dr. Lougheed, so I'm happy to monopolize his time and ask them. Chris, I'll give people another minute and ask something else that just occurred to me as you're speaking. There's the question of, we have the letters, letters of Symmachus, and maybe you said this and I missed it. Letters of Symmachus, Sidonius, and Pliny. What about letters like that are to them? So I'm familiar with the collection of Cicero's letters, and we sometimes have the letter and its correspondent. Do you have a sense, or how do we understand those kind of letters finding their way into collections, and how do they work as part of this autobiographical presentation?
There are a few. There's a letter by Ausonius, who's the tutor to the Emperor Gratian, to Symmachus that ends up in collection there. I guess you'd pick the best, of these and kind of include them where they. I do, and actually the letter from Ausonius to Symmachus is very interesting because it says. From this point of view of Symmachus as genuine, because Ausonius says when you were, I guess they met in person at court in Trier, and Ausonius says you were at the palace where people show their faces but hide their minds. You were a true friend to me. So it's the idea. So it emphasizes that someone with name recognition saw Symmachus as genuine. Yeah. Right,
and I guess you want to, you pick the right people too. And now I'm thinking back to social media and thinking that it's really great if a certain person likes my tweet or comments on it, who's got that blue check mark beside them. Suddenly, I'm happy with that. I might take a screenshot of it. All right, we have some questions though, so I'll shut up. So from our colleague here, Dr. Whately, a bit of a big question. But to what degree does genre influence how authors composed letters? What I'm getting at is, if you were able to look at the letter collections in other languages like Syriac from late antiquity, would you expect to find similar tendencies in all respects, or would they differ in significant ways?
Okay, so genre. Okay, so that's an interesting question. In terms of letter collections themselves as a genre, that seems to be a specifically Latin thing created in the fifth century, late fourth, early fifth century, and ultimately by Sidonius. So Symmachus probably wouldn't have recognized this as being a genre. Um, just in terms of the letters themselves, fortunately, I can't say that much about Syriac, but if you read the letters of Libanius in Greek, you they're a bit more convoluted, but really you could translate them into Latin, and they could pass for letters of Symmachus. So letters of recommendation are written uh, in different ways, in the same way in different languages. A lot of these topoi carry over. Um, yeah. Yeah, in terms of the collections themselves, there has been there's been a recent edited volume on letter collections in late antiquity, which gets into that. There's a lot of, in terms of the collections themselves, there's a lot of variety. Yeah, in terms of the letters, there's a lot of commonplaces.
Great. We have another question then from the friend of the department here, Natalie Swain, who asks, I'm really curious to know, is there a, well, this kind of attaches to that question, is there a pre-Roman tradition of publishing letters? Are they similar or different? So if you have more to expand on the pre-Roman, I guess if there's an earlier Hellenistic or...
Okay, so pre-Roman, there are, there are there's pre-Roman, there's Greek letters. We have the letters of Plato, for example, which may or may not be genuine. Um, a lot of like the Greek philosophical schools really generate these letter collections, I guess partly because the students really, part of just the veneration of heads of philosophical schools by their students. Um, and there's, yeah, and a lot of those are probably spurious, but uh, yeah, does that inform later Roman practice? I'm not sure, but yeah, the letter collection it's more a kind of late thing. Um, it only really fully forms as a genre in at the very end of the Roman Empire, especially in the Latin West.
Thank you. And then another question here from Dr. Melissa Funke. Hi, Chris. Thanks for your talk. Are there any responses to these letters in which the writer questions this type of characterization? For example, calls out the flattery or any other aspect, I guess.
Okay, so is there a letter in which someone could say you're flattering me and what you say? Yeah, that's trying to think of an example. Yeah, I think there are where uh, yeah, I guess one thing I can think of is that a letter where Symmachus writes to his friend Nicomachus in Book Two, the addressee line, which apparently was simple in the letter as sent, and it's hard to say whether the addressee line that we have, was the original one, but it apparently this letter went out as something really flowery, and Nicomachus apparently wrote back to say, "Why are you? We're supposed to be close friends. Why are you writing to me? Why are you writing this formal letter to me?" And then Symmachus writes back to say, that was my secretary. I just put that in by mistake. That wasn't what I dictated." Um, yeah. I'm trying to yeah. Um, yeah. Trying to think if I can think of any other examples. It is an interesting question.
We have another question from Dr. Matt Gibbs from McEwen University. He's building on Peter's question, my question. I'm intrigued by this idea of self-representation in some of these collections you talked about, Chris. Would you say that this was linked to theories of ethos and or persona that we see in Latin rhetoric, and particularly that of Cicero?
Okay. Yeah, and that's with Demetrius, he says that it talks about characterization in letter, which you get in every genre, but especially in letters. Um, yeah. Yeah, it'd be interesting. It's hard to know how self-consciously, well, presumably someone like Symmachus or Pliny is doing this self-consciously, constructing a sort of persona. Exactly how they would think about that, um, whether it's being thought in the same ways as for rhetoric, that's quite possible since they would have been educated in that. Um, yeah. Yeah, sorry, I guess that's a bit of a non-answer, but yeah, thanks for the question. I'll have to look into that.
Well, it's a good question, right? Sometimes when it generates a non-answer or it generates food for thought for later. So that's always it's always good to get. I think that question about how these things are connected to other genres. I had always separated off letters, and I think you've demonstrated their connection to other genres already. So it's kind of interesting to build on. Dr. Whately has a follow-up question from his question and that of Natalie Swain earlier, and asks, do you know if these Latin letters informed later letter writing? It's a tongue twister. Do you know if these Latin letters informed later letter writing in the medieval or early modern worlds?
Okay, so uh, yes, I mean, it's been argued that Petrarch finding the letters of Cicero set off the Renaissance. Um, Pliny in particular, yeah, we do know that the letters of Symmachus certainly are kept. Uh, yeah, my impression is that yes, they were stylistic models, but I'd have to get more detail on that. Yeah, I think yeah, like in the Renaissance, Cicero is, of course, a bit more the model, um, and I'm frankly is a more interesting writer. Um, but yeah, yeah, no, that is interesting.
Well, I think that is the questions we had, and maybe I see, Chris, we're at about 1 hour of you talking and answering questions and so on. So perhaps we can call this to a close for now. The talk has been recorded, so it'll be up on our YouTube channel soon. I'm a bit behind, but we'll have both of our first talks of the year up soon. And I'm sure Dr. Lougheed would be happy to entertain questions and on this topic, and you can find his email address and contact information at the University of Toronto Department of Classics page. Before I thank Chris, I'd like to just let you know that we do have 2 further talks still in our autumn series on Zoom. In 2 weeks, I think it is, 2 weeks from today, November 5th, my colleague Dr. Melissa Funke will give a talk entitled Building a Narrative, Use and Misuse of Antiquity at the Manitoba Legislature. No previous experience with the Manitoba Legislature is required, but a talk that will investigate how antiquity has been used in this Canadian Legislative Assembly from the early 20th century. And then following her a week later on November 12th to close out our fall series is Dr. Warren Heward, another colleague of mine from here at U of W, with a talk entitled Heracles, Plato, and Philosophical Immortality, a deep topic to let you ruminate over the holidays that will soon follow. With that, I do want to thank Dr. Lougheed for tackling an author who's famously dull, at least one of these 3, which is what a thing to have to do, but to showing us, in fact, that Symmachus and then the rest are anything but dull in the way that they represent themselves. And I very much appreciated especially the connections that we can draw from this, and I know you're interested in this, Chris, to the modern world and to self-representation in all genres and in all times and places. So with that, I'd like to, on behalf of myself and the Department of Classics and my absent co-organizer, Ruth Dickinson, to thank you, Chris, for joining us today. And thank you to our audience members. I hope we'll see you on November 5th and November 12th. And with that, I'll wish you a good weekend. Thanks very much for coming.